Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating subject, architectural criticism. Now, our core goal here is to prove something fundamental. Criticism isn't just about someone subjectively looking at a building and saying, yeah, I like this one, or nah, I hate that one. It's actually a rigorous, theoretical framework. It's a tool that allows us to decode and understand the built environment on a much deeper level. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover defining criticism, the nature of the critic, approaches to criticism, the Feldman method, criteria for evaluation, and finally, theory and objective judgment. So let's start with section 1, defining architectural criticism. When we use the word criticism, we really have to look at its origins to get what it's all about. It actually comes from the Greek word krinein, which literally means to cut, separate, divide, and distinguish. It's so important to note here that criticism isn't inherently negative, right? It's just diagnostic. You're engaging in analytical and discriminating actions to intelligently discuss a work. It goes way beyond simply describing what a building looks like. It's about dissecting it to examine its meaning, its performance, its context, and the human experience within it. Moving right along to section 2, the nature of the critic. Now, what's really interesting about this is that a critic's ability to adopt a specific worldview puts them in a highly powerful position when they evaluate a building. But because they filter absolutely everything through their own culture, their behavior, and their values, they inherently bring biases. A well-skilled critic with a broad understanding of different cultures provides a massive service to us, but we always have to remember that their review is shaped from the very instant they begin looking at a space. Basically, they are an authority, but not an infallible one. Because of that, an all-inclusive, completely objective evaluation is, well, it's simply impossible. What a critic actually sees is really just the intersection of objective facts and the facts that confirm their pre-existing beliefs. No single critique can provide an evaluation from every conceivable angle. Criticism is always influenced by its circumstances and its context. That means a building can always be understood in a totally new, different light, just depending on who happens to be doing the looking. Which brings us to section 3, approaches to criticism. Critics have multiple methods at their disposal, and they all ask very different questions about the exact same architectural work. Let's look at 2 contrasting ones. First, interpretive criticism asks, what does the architecture mean? It examines historical references, meanings, and symbols. For instance, when looking at Le Corbusier's chapel at Ronchamp, interpretive criticism notes how the curved roof might act as a protective shelter, or maybe a form rising heavenward, conveying this deeply spiritual atmosphere with the light. In contrast, normative criticism evaluates architecture by strict, established regulations or standards, things like function, beauty, or accessibility. Think of evaluating Le Corbusier's Villa Savoy against his own strict 5 points of modern architecture. Without those defined criteria, a normative critic just can't support their judgment. Then we have classic criticism, which anchors a building within the grand timeline of architectural history. We compare buildings historically to understand exactly where they belong. This approach takes an analytical nature, evaluating a work on a general formal basis and then comparing it with recognized masterpieces. A perfect example of this, taking the late modernist work of the New York Five and directly comparing it to the historic work of Le Corbusier. Doing that helps us identify striking similarities in things like their white geometric forms, free plans, and abstract facades. Now let's explore 3 more distinct approaches. Contextual criticism explores the historical, environmental, and social setting. For example, assessing Hassan Fatih's New Gorna village by looking at its mud brick vaults and courtyards to see how they actually responded to the residents' real social practices and local construction methods. Next up is impressionistic criticism, which is purely emotional and sensory. Think of the intense feelings of unity, stillness, and wonder you get standing right under the oculus of the Pantheon. It's totally subjective. Finally, intentional criticism judges a work against the architect's original aims. Brasilia, for example, was intended to represent perfect, ordered modernity and national progress. Did its monumental access and superblocks actually achieve that vision? Interestingly, even if an architect's grand intentions totally fail, the resulting building could still be highly valuable in its own right. Our final approach in this section is intrinsic criticism, which is often called the new criticism. Here, the critic tries to remain totally impersonal. They strip away external biographies, psychological intentions, or sweeping histories, and they focus purely on the architectural object's internal qualities, things like composition, proportions, and materials. Take the Barcelona Pavilion. Intrinsic criticism would look exclusively at how its independent walls, glass, steel, marble, water, and reflections create a continuous spatial experience, completely ignoring everything outside of those compositional realities. All right, on to Section 4, the Feldman method. So Edmund Feldman gives us a highly useful four-stage process for formal criticism. It's a very actionable pathway that stops us from jumping to conclusions too quickly. And to see how this step-by-step method works, let's think about a highly recognizable structure, like the Sydney Opera House, as we walk through the steps. Step 1 is description. You simply list neutral, observable facts without making any sort of judgment. For the Sydney Opera House, you'd note its concrete podium, its shell-shaped roofs, and its waterfront setting. It tells us what exists, not whether it's successful. Step 2 is analysis. You uncover how that formal language and structure are actually organized. Step 3 is interpretation. Now you form hypotheses. What is the overall mood, meaning, or expressive quality of this visual evidence? Finally, step 4 is judgment. You actually suspend your final verdict until this exact step, evaluating the building's overall value based on established criteria and combining suitable approaches with clear architectural evidence. That brings us nicely to Section 5, criteria for evaluation. When judging the built environment, critics typically have to balance two massive sets of criteria. First, we measure the human impact using humanitarian criteria. Is the building socially and culturally accepted? Is it economically feasible? Does it support the political and intellectual orientations of its time? Second, we evaluate the physical realities using urban and architectural criteria. This looks at the formative aesthetics, how the building fits into the city's schematic road networks, its environmental compatibility, and the actual structural techniques used to build it. A truly comprehensive modern critique perfectly balances this human impact with the structural reality, because remember, no single type of criticism provides a complete judgment all on its own. Finally, let's wrap up with Section 6, theory and objective judgment. To fully grasp how architectural theory and architectural criticism work together, we have to understand their fundamental difference in direction. Criticism has an analytical attitude. It seeks to decompose and deconstruct the architectural work into its primary elements to get a comprehensive view. Architectural theory, on the opposite hand, has a compositional attitude. It seeks to construct. It brings together facts, principles, and assumptions to formulate entirely new statements and design rules. So one deconstructs while the other constructs. It is a continuous, inseparable feedback loop. Objective criticism is literally impossible without theory, because theory provides the normative tools, the criteria of architectural quality, and the terminology that the critic uses as a foundation. But the relationship definitely goes both ways. By conducting behavioral, cultural, and structural studies of built products, criticism brings awareness to what architectural theory needs to address and refine next. They just constantly feed each other in this incredible cycle. And this brings us to our final thought. We've proven today that architectural criticism is a highly focused, principled framework that relies entirely on strong theory to evaluate a building's material, formal, and social integrity. No single type of criticism provides a complete picture on its own. So I want to leave you with this challenge. If objective criticism always relies on theory, how will your next architectural design seek to establish its own distinct worldview? It really forces us to think deeply about the intentions, the context, and the theories behind every single space we occupy. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the built environment around you.